Hello, and welcome to The Life of the Mind, an interview with Marek Matraszek. My name is Fisher Derderian, and I am the Executive Director here at the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. For those of you joining us for the first time today, the foundation was created last year to support and further the work and writings of the great British philosopher, Sir Roger Scruton. Our mission is to establish Scruton's legacy through the conservation, care, and continuation of humane wisdom and culture from the Western tradition. To that end, we've been hosting a number of events over the last 9 months, including conversations on Scruton's political thought, his work on the tonal tradition and music, as well as a series of interviews on traditional urbanism and architecture. I'm very excited about today's event as it marks the first interview in a new series on another important aspect of Scruton's work, which is that of Central Europe. Our hope with this series, The Life of the Mind, is to not only get a better understanding of what it is Scruton did and his impact in the countries around Central Europe, but also explore how they withstood threats to the life of the mind and how under the communist regimes and since. But I'll leave it there for our series host and interviewer, Dr. Mikołaj Sławkowski-Rode, to pick up. Mikołaj is the Foundation's Senior Fellow in the Philosophy of Culture and our Director of Central European Programs. He's also an Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw and a Research Fellow and Tutor in Philosophy at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. He holds a number of other impressive positions and is involved in a number of other projects across Central Europe and the UK. But I'll leave it there and hand it over to you, Mikołaj.
Thanks, Fisher, for that very generous introduction. Perhaps I should start with a few words of explanation of the topic or the title of this series, which is The Life of the Mind. Roger was very well known for his work underground during the communist era and starting universities and starting new curricula and courses right after the transformation in the late 80s and early 90s in Central Europe. This is something that was an important part of his life, which he understood not only as something that fitted in with his political thought, but also something that was important to him personally and something that coincided with his thinking about the human person and how the human person should fulfill their obligations to others and to the community that they belong to. In his fantastic intellectual memoir, Gentle Regrets, in the chapter Sleeping Cities, Roger describes the cities of Central Europe that he visited in the 80s and early 90s in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland as sleeping cities. He speaks about them as unopened tombs in which everything has been preserved without any change and without any expectation that any change will occur. He says that this image of the stillness of the life of the mind in Central Europe struck him most when he visited the Agitation Center in Prague on his third or fourth visit to that country, which he describes as follows. And I'll read a little bit of Roger's wonderful prose on that experience, which I think illustrates exactly how he experienced the situation in the region. Roger says, the message of the center was that things here cannot change, that you are not to hope or plan or strive, that everything has been fixed eternally and that nothing remains for each successive generation, but to append its signature to the fixed and senseless decree. Looking through that dirty window, I saw fear in a handful of dust. Roger tried to resist that stillness by engaging students in the life of the mind in various ways, in Poland in particular, in summer schools and seminars in Krasicin, but also in Kazimierz Dolny, and in the Palace of Jabłonna right near Warsaw, where he also invited students from England, particularly from Oxford, who attended those seminars. He saw that this stillness in the life of the mind that, as he thought, deadens the soul and makes human relationships impossible is something that can be perceived not only on this side of the Iron Curtain, where the communist regime imposed its mark, but also in the West where he came from. He thought that the contacts between the students who he invited and those who sought after the contact that he provided here was particularly fruitful in that it changed something in the still and unchangeable ways in which both sides both sides were used to. And to start this series, which explores this striving that Roger was involved in throughout his life, not only in the times where he visited the communist countries in Central Europe, but also after here and back home with his students, including myself in later parts of his life. Then Marek Matraszek, who was there from the very beginning, or almost from the very beginning, who is not only Roger's partner in crime, may I say, at many times, but also his personal friend. So let me just introduce Marek to everyone briefly who doesn't know him. Marek studied at Magdalen College, Oxford for PPE, Philosophy, Politics and Economics, graduating in 1984. And in the following year, he taught in Poland, in Lublin, for one semester before returning to Magdalen, I infer, inspired by his experience to study for a master's degree in Russian and Eastern European studies. He moved to Poland after the transformation in 1990 as a freelance political consultant and worked closely with the British Conservative Party and the US Republican Party, and with Roger as well, in assisting the activities of these parties in Central Europe. And in 1992, he was appointed the representative of the Margaret Thatcher Foundation in the region, and continued to establish CEC, which was the first Western-style public affairs consultancy in the region. He has since written very widely on Polish international affairs for publications all around the world, including The Spectator, the Wall Street Journal, the Warsaw Business Journal, and so on, and published several reports on the Polish political scene and the restoration of Polish economy after the transformation in the early 90s. So thank you very much, Marek, for agreeing to speak with me about Roger's work in Central Europe during the 80s and 90s. And so my first question to you, since we're starting the series speaking more closely about Roger's work here, is how you yourself met Roger, and what was your first impression of him?
Well, thank you, Mikołaj, and thank you, Fisher, for this opportunity to talk about Roger's work in Central Europe and Poland, in a very important part of Roger's life, but also the lives of the people that he encountered during those difficult years under communism. We'll delve deeper into that in a minute, I'm sure, Mikołaj. A lot of people know the anecdote of how I originally met Roger. That actually reflects the ignorance of my Oxford education, if nothing else, because as you rightly say, Mikołaj, after my first degree at Oxford, I decided to actually spend a whole year at the Catholic University. And one October evening, I recall, I was walking along the corridor and I noticed an advertisement on the notice board saying that an English professor would be coming to talk about Kant and Wittgenstein. And his name was Roger Scruton. Now, one of the benefits of an Oxford education, I say ironically, is I had no idea of who Roger Scruton was, despite having studied philosophy for about 3 years beforehand, which just goes to show how deprived that education was in some senses. But on a serious note, I obviously attended, met Roger, and I always remember the first thing he ever said to me after I introduced myself. He said, "That's very interesting, nice to meet you. Do you know any anti-communists in this town?" And that was actually the way it symbolized Roger so much, not just in his directness, but obviously his his concern to get down to business, as he always used to say, and to really start talking about the important things in his life. I did, in fact, know some anti-communists, and I introduced them to each other. And that was the start of, it wasn't quite the start, or it certainly wasn't the start of Roger's activities in Central Europe, still less Poland, because as you rightly say, Mikołaj, since the early 80s, in fact, the late 70s, he'd been traveling to Poland, organizing various academic seminars, not entirely covert, but not public. But that recognition of that encounter with Roger was the start of, I think, a second phase of Roger's involvement certainly in Poland, which was much more focused on assisting the various underground publications and groupings that had started to develop. Remember that in 1984, it was literally 1984. It was a year without hope. Father Popiełuszko had just been murdered by the communist secret police. There was no seeming end in sight of communism. There was no Gorbachev. The Soviet Union was still very much in its Cold War mode in relation to the West. So matters looked very bleak indeed. And it was into this bleakness, into this darkness, that Roger arrived in carrying with him the goodwill and the support and the assistance of a remarkable number of people in the United Kingdom, in England, and in London, who he himself had mobilized to start and establish the Jagiellonian Trust, which was a legitimate English charity, still under English charity law in about 1983, designed to bring cultural, intellectual, and moral support for the cause of academic freedom in Poland and Hungary, actually. And in that period of time when I became involved in working with Roger after 1984, 1985, as I was saying earlier, and the work of the foundation was focused on organizing a network of couriers who operated on a regular basis into Poland and Hungary, taking books, material support, sometimes entire pieces of printing equipment concealed in suitcases, which were blatantly taken through Polish customs at Warsaw Airport, much to the ignorance of the controlling authorities, as well as organizing a network of visitors, academics, some of them very well known, who traveled to Poland into places as far afield as Przemyśl in the southeast corner of Poland, the Ukrainian border, to Wrocław in the west, Warsaw, of course, but other cities such as Gdańsk, Kraków, and Łódź as well, where Roger had identified groups of dissidents, anti-communists who are meeting together, publishing, creating the fabric, the initial seeds that would later then grow into civil society in the later 1980s, and obviously then form the foundation of free association in the 1990s. I may be getting ahead of myself a little bit, but that's certainly how I met Roger and how we got going together. And I had the privilege of being asked by him then to become the secretary of the trust. We spent 4 or 5 very exciting years doing the sort of work that I've just described.
Since you mentioned the Jagiellonian Trust, I know you have a fantastic souvenir from that time, which is the minute book of the Jagiellonian Trust, which is all handwritten by Roger himself when he was taking down minutes of the meetings.
Yes. It's a legendary tome. I have it here, and it is indeed. It was actually typed up. Roger we used to meet for some almost conspiratorially in London, about 200 yards away from the Czechoslovak embassy. Roger at that time lived in Notting Hill Gate, and 6 Linden Gardens was his flat. And it's literally just around the corner from the Czechoslovak embassy, which was obviously stuffed with STV spies and listening devices. Whether they were actually reaching into the cellars of 6 Linden Gardens, I'm not sure. And every few months we would meet, and the trustees of the foundation, Roger himself, obviously, Jessica Douglas-Hume, Agnieszka Kołakowska, the late Dennis O'Keefe, Timothy Garton-Ash, and others. Caroline Cox, of course, late Baroness Cox, as she now is, was a key player. And just to give you an idea of the sort of circles that Roger and Jessica at that time were seeking to mobilize, actually almost the very first minutes of the meeting, 13th of November 1983, where there's a discussion amongst the trustees about the sort of people that in the UK that can be mobilized in support of these activities to help the underground, the anti-communist underground in Poland. So point 3 of the minutes on that evening, Caroline Cox reported she was awaiting a reply from the Bishop of London. Jessica Douglas-Hume said she'll be shortly having information regarding other patrons, and also suggested Tim Garton-Ash. He did agree. Roger Scruton reported Norman Stone and Christine Stone had agreed in principle. Antonia Fraser was reticent, and it was agreed she should not be pursued at this stage. Further approaches, Agnieszka Kołakowska to Norman Davis, Roger Scruton to Malcolm Muggeridge, Cardinal Hume and the Duke of Norfolk, Caroline Cox to Sir Reginald Burley, former president of the Royal College of Surgeons. The Duke of Buccleuch and Lawrence van der Poest were also being approached. It was agreed that the latter required more thought, and further ideas would be presented at the following meeting. So, I mean, I just quote that because it gives a flavor of those lovely evenings of which I have very, very fond memories. And perhaps at some stage when the collected works of Roger come to be republished, this tome can be included in the collection, because it is written by Roger's hand in a very sort of, there's some real hilarity amongst some of the notes and of the minutes. It's, as you say, it is a legendary tome, and it's in my safe hands. So it will receive the light of day at some stage, I'm sure.
Wonderful. In that short quote, you can very much sense Roger's affection for the region. It's not only something, even though he's speaking about organizational matters, let's say, you can sense that it's not only something that he approaches as a grim task, which he sees as struggling against this darkness which you mentioned, which he also, of course, perceived, but he also saw something refreshing and deeply important in the region that he thought was in a way missing or forgotten in the West. What would your impression of what Roger cherished about the region and thought important in it would be? How would you characterize Roger's approach to what was valuable here, even in those dark times?
Well, yes, that's a very interesting question, Mikołaj. It's actually probably not a question that can't be answered very quickly or shortly. You're right. I mean, Central Europe played an absolutely crucial role in Roger's life. And you're right. What was it that attracted him to that part of Europe? I mean, the most superficial way of looking at it would be to say it was all to do with politics. You know, there was no freedom, people were in prison, there was no freedom of speech, there was no free economy, so, perhaps to an extent. But I think, you know, the thing that really attracted him was on a much sort of deeper, almost existential level, where he saw in Central Europe, as you were perhaps rightly quoted from Gentle Regrets, on the one hand, a part of Europe civilizationally had been caught in time, as it were, that some of the aspects of the modern Western world had not yet encroached on life within Central Europe. But I think he saw it above all as a place where those things that he himself felt the most important in his life, the ideas of community, the ideas of interpersonal friendship. And I think that's actually something that's very understated. Roger absolutely started, his whole philosophy is based on the interpersonal, on our relationships with others. And in Central Europe, I think he saw that this aspect of the human existence, whereby we start our relationship to the world from the relationship we have with other people, because of the lack of freedom, as something that was continuing to exist. He certainly, of course, was enchanted by the aesthetic of the region, whether it was in the countryside or whether it was in the architecture, especially in Prague. Especially, that was one of the things that he appreciated very much. But it was also, I think, the two other things that he saw were being preserved almost in time. One is the idea of the national identity and the desire for national sovereignty, which remained very, very strong in so many parts of this part of the world, and also, above all, continued faith in God. Roger's relationship to religion, of course, was ambiguous, and that's perhaps a topic for a discussion, another seminar. But what he saw was in Central Europe was that God, especially in Poland, had not yet departed this world. He saw religion, the existence of religion, as being something which remained hugely important for the people. And what you did not have, the desacralization of the world, which he felt was the foundation of the loss of humility and the source of the rise of the arrogance of the human spirit. So the combination of all those things, the aesthetics, the relationships, the interpersonal relationships, the continued beliefs in nationhood and community and family, but above all, the overarching continued faith in God as something that was rescuing this part of Europe, not just from communism, but from some of the great problems and challenges that Roger was seeing himself in the West as well. So he felt very much at home in Central Europe, and I think when he remembered Central Europe in later years, particularly over the last few years, just before he died, he always perceived it through the friendships that he had made there, the individual relationships that he had found, the friendships that he had brought with him back to England, and that was what really attracted him to Central Europe. It was a place where modernity, understood in all its aspects, had not yet found its home, and a place that was really well prepared to meet the challenges of modernity when communism did finally collapse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So before we continue with this fantastically interesting topic, which I'm very much interested in Roger's thought as well, I should just say, Fisher reminds me that he's open for collecting questions. If anyone listening in has any questions for Marek, please just send them in the chat, and Fisher will forward them to me, and I'll address them to Marek in the order that they come in. So returning to Roger and Central Europe, it's from what you say, and also from the quote that I started this meeting with. This really striking vision of Roger's approach to the region, and not only to the region, but also to the West, and to how he perceived the role of the individual in the community and interpersonal relationships as a whole emerges, which is something that some people might find a little bit counterintuitive in light of Roger's thought and how it is often perceived in the framework of just a conservative thinker, which is that he tried to resist this still frame within which we function. He thought that in Central Europe under communism, this frame was provided or imposed by, of course, the centralized oppressive system, but that the West also had its frame, and that his role, or he thought that his duty was to try and enable people to at least wriggle themselves out of that frame a little bit, and try to launch themselves on a path of development of some sort. So he did not think that people should stay within certain ways, but rather develop. His idea was of a certain development that was stilled, both here and in the West, for different reasons. So what would you think Roger would make? Well, he did comment on this, of course, a little bit, but what would you think Roger would make in light of this, of the developments that have happened since '89? What did he make, and what would he have made of the developments that are happening now? A very moment, I think, in the history of the relationships between Central Europe and Western Europe that we have at the moment, something that Roger himself was involved in, promoting Brexit. How does that fit into to this idea of development that he wanted to promote?
Another very long answer to a short question, Mikołaj. I think what if I understand your question correctly, what was Roger really trying to teach people? And I think what he objected to, certainly in Central Europe, and in fact not only in Central Europe but after 1989, the West, was the way of perceiving the world in an ideological fashion. Roger's critics, of whom there are many and largely ignorant, often make the mistake of saying, well, he was an ideologue. In fact, he wasn't an ideologue. He was actually quite the reverse of an ideologue. Because as Kenneth Minogue, who is a great friend of Roger's, said himself, one of the challenges of modernity is the way in which the human mind is constantly attracted by ideological constructs in which the reality of the world is presented as an illusion. And Marxism was an example of that, where the reality of the world was presented not as it really was, but as a conspiracy of historical forces concealing the power of the bourgeois capitalist and the false consciousness that he was imposing on the masses. And that ideological mindset was obviously again reflected in Nazism, where reality was seen as essentially a conspiracy of the Jews. And it was taken over after 1989 in Roger's eyes as one ideology collapsed. Other ideologies came and to replace them. And they were ideologies we see today, and we've seen them over the last few years. Douglas Murray has written about this, of course, most eloquently, the ideology that says the reality that we're in is not what it seems, is actually a conspiracy of the white patriarchy, or there's some other nefarious force which is really the source of power in society. And Roger's approach to all these problems, and what was one of the reasons why, again, he was attracted to Central Europe, he said that's not the way the world should be perceived. It should be perceived the way it appears to us to be. And he loved the phrase of Oscar Wilde, which was, "It's a very shallow man indeed who perceives the world other to be merely the way in which it appears." And Roger said, well, yeah, exactly. That is the way that the world should be perceived. And so our mode of thinking, as I was saying earlier, should start from the personal. It should start from the relationship with the other. It should start from the recognition that the reality that we need to start from is our relationship with other persons. And then we build up from that into relationships with our communities, with our neighbors, with others who share our interests. In other words, and get us to understand the world as a world of beauty, in which it really is the appearance of objects that bring pleasure to life. And that life is not all about an endless conflict between hidden forces, that the reality of life is about the need to find compromise and friendship amongst people. And we should just calm down a little bit, to use Roger's phrase, and see the world as it is and make friends with each other, the world as it is. And that's best done amongst people that we can communicate with, that we can form bonds with, that we do have, with whom we share a common language and a common identity, common values. And that's why he was so strongly engaged in the debate on Brexit, why he believed that in the very long run, loyalty built upon community, common culture, and national identity is the best source of political stability. So, although Roger's interest in European politics spanned 40 years, if not more, there's a common thread that runs through it, because all his interests in life were driven by a very specific way in which he believed the world should be perceived. And he found himself at home, literally at home, in Sunday Hill Farm in Wiltshire, and in the friendships and the family and the church that he attended. But it was also why he sought friendships in Central Europe, and where he found people most able to accept him and wish to engage with him on an intellectual level. So I think, that's the strand that explains the path of Roger from London to Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest in the 70s and 80s, and then back to his home in the decade or so before he passed away.
Mm-hmm. Well, but it would be, in a way, I think, an oversimplified view to say that what the West can, or what Roger thought the West could give Central Europe in that time is free markets, and what Central Europe could give the West is the sincerity of religious feeling and a groundedness in culture that the West has become somewhat skeptical of. So the idea of friendship did play an extremely important role in Roger's philosophy, and he saw a certain paradox in friendship. He thought that friendship is impossible if we've got nothing to give the other person. And this is why communism made friendship so difficult, because it took everything away in one sense. But the West also takes a lot, or took a lot away, that we would normally be able to give. But the paradox is in that if we seek what the other person can give us in friendship, we're not finding friends, we're only deceiving people. So friendship should be its own reward, even though if it's impossible, out the gift that we can receive from another. So speaking about the relationship between Central Europe and Western Europe, how would you describe what Roger would think, or what he thought the mutual benefits could be? This is also a personal question, because of course you are friends, very good friends and lifelong friends, who received a great deal from one another, but also a more abstract question about the relationship between the cultures and the regions. What could one draw from another? It wasn't merely a question of the exchange of political or economic systems or sets of values, was it?
Well, no, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that what did Roger find valuable in Central Europe, and what attracted him to Central Europe in the first place? And we touched upon the political aspect, we touched on the aesthetic aspect, we touched on the cultural aspect, but there also was the philosophical aspect. A lot of people, and obviously in a basic sense, Roger was a British philosopher, But when you look at his writings and you actually try to sort of glean where he actually drew his real inspiration from, and you just list the names of the philosophers that he obviously drew from very, very clearly. I mean, you start off with Kant, who came from Königsberg, or in East Prussia as it then was. Then you have Hegel, where Roger took much of his inspiration about the importance of law and civil society and the state and its interplay. And then you have, his other great hero was Husserl. And then you are drawn, and you understand why he was so attracted to the Czech Republic, because he saw the importance of the Husserlian phenomenological movement through Patočka, inspiring Czech dissidents, and rounding off perhaps with Wittgenstein and so on. All of these names, and I'm not name dropping them just on purpose, but it's a way of actually illustrating that Roger was really a continental philosopher, and what he drew from all those strands of thought and what attracted him to Central Europe and what he thought was most valuable in Central Europe. And that's why, so I'm coming back to your question, is because all of those philosophers, particularly Husserl and Patočka, had an instinct that there are more important ways of looking at the world than purely through the scientific mode of understanding it. That there is another way that the world can be perceived. It's the mode of aesthetic experience. It's a mode which can only be understood through poetry or through classical music, or all the other aesthetic and cultural modes of communication which allow us to see the world above all as an object of beauty and not just functionality. And I think that's what he really wanted us to take from Central Europe, not just in the sentiments of ordinary people and their belief in God and their faith in their belief in national identity or their fidelity to family and traditional values. But I think he wanted to reabsorb into Western thinking the continental mode of philosophy. He started off, as you know, in Cambridge, and he started off, obviously, he understood British analytical philosophy, but he found it very, very dry. He didn't want to go down that dry rabbit hole of logical positivism and of abstracting philosophy away from the transcendent and the aesthetic. And by trying to bring that back into respectability through his works, I think he's left a great gift to people who are either studying philosophy or reading about ideas, that he re-legitimated the continental perspective. And he achieved this remarkable synthesis between trying to bring those strands of continental philosophy back into the mainstream, and he merged it with what was what he felt was the most valuable thing in British philosophy, which is the strands of pragmatism, empiricism, the various things that he felt at home with in British philosophy as well, English philosophy, Scottish philosophy of the Enlightenment. And I think those were the things that drove him. And everything else that we've discussed or that are about Roger are almost a function of that task that he set himself. And I think he succeeded tremendously.
We've got several questions coming in which seem to be moving in the direction I wanted to move in as well, which is that of how Roger's thought would apply to the current situation in Central Europe. But since we've got some questions, I'll give the floor to some voices from the audience. So the first question is from Guy Whitehouse, and it goes, Roger said he had a particular soft spot for what was then Czechoslovakia. Given what you've said about his interest in the religion and national sovereignty, what would he make of Czechoslovakia splitting in two? and surveys showing it was one of the least religious areas of the West.
Well, it's no coincidence, of course, that he's the equivalent of the Jagiellonian Trust, which covered Poland and Hungary when he decided to set up an analogous situation for what was then Czechoslovakia. He called it the Jan Hus Foundation, which gave, what he tried basically to do with that was to say that was the tradition that had developed within the Czech lands of religious dissent, and something that was then in part ingrained in the Czech and Bohemian psyche. Czech and Slovakia are obviously very different culturally and religiously. And Slovakia much more Catholic than the Czech lands. Roger was had friends in both countries. He was equally developing networks in Bratislava. He became very close friends with Jan Czarnogórsky, who was a leading dissident in the 70s and 80s in Czechoslovakia. And obviously the split of Czechoslovakia was sad for him, because he felt that what was being lost was something that was a great achievement, despite communism. The fact that and also in the pre-war period that Czechoslovakia had actually existed, that there was a reconciliation between these two peoples was something that he felt very valuable, and he was saddened by that split. But again, it was something that he recognized was almost inevitable. I mean, the whole ethos of Central Europe in the 1990s was built around the concept of self-determination. And it was a process that obviously didn't stop in Czechoslovakia. It was then it exploded into conflict in the Balkans as Yugoslavia collapsed. And so that was something that he regretted greatly. He was not a nationalist in the vulgar sense. I mean, he recognized the importance of national identity, but he really recognized that there was no sense or no purpose in national antagonisms developing the way they had done in Yugoslavia. And I think it's to the credit of the leaderships of Slovakia and the Czech Republic in the 1990s and the 2000s. They worked so closely together. The political dynamics in Slovakia obviously went off beam in the 1990s with people like Mečiar emerging. But ultimately these countries worked together. And Roger was a great believer in organizations such as the Visegrad Group, which was established in the 1990s of Poland, Czech, Slovakia, and Hungary, to create that institution that would work together to bring those countries into NATO, for example. Slovakia followed later, of course, and then into other international institutions. So he was ultimately someone who received that split with sadness, and he worked very, very, very hard to ensure that split didn't develop into national antagonisms.
Mm-hmm. I've got another question from Crowford Gribben. Very interesting question. In recent years, a number of American conservatives, Orthodox and Catholic, have suggested that traditionally minded believers should prepare themselves for a new status as dissidents, but in an increasingly liberal West. I accept that Scruton had an ambiguous relationship to religion, but how might he have responded to these arguments in favor of a Benedict option and the like?
That's a great question. I think, in a way, we're greatly saddened by Roger's passing, but I think he would have seen, even in the last 2 years, he would have been saddened greatly by what was happening. I think, he himself, as you know, had retreated almost into a Benedictine style of existence, because from the very beginning of his academic career, from the early 1980s, he'd been increasingly expunged from academic life. He left his beloved job at Birkbeck College, and he became increasingly isolated in the mainstream academic community. That's why he turned his attentions and support to institutions such as Buckingham University, where he felt that he could contribute to developing continued academic rigor. Why for a few years he left England altogether and departed to Virginia in the United States to teach and lecture at various institutes and institutions there. And if he was actually attracted to America, because America, until very recently, was actually a very, very welcoming to him. He found a home in various institutions in Washington that gave him posts that he could lecture from. And I think he would have been very saddened by the whole thing that we're seeing now of cancel culture and so on, of conservative academics. And ultimately, he was really focused on building up his own community of people who would listen to him. He remained very, very active through his activity in the what he called Scrutopia, which was the Roger Scruton Summer School, which attracted huge amounts of people who would come from all around the world to Sunday Hill Farm to spend 10 days or 2 weeks together, learning from him about what he felt to be important in life. I think he, towards the end of his life, he said, one thing to me. He said, Marek, I really think I've said what I always had to say, and I'm facing the end with a sense of satisfaction. I think he really did give us, to go back to that, what I think is the intent of that question, he left us a huge corpus of literature. Both Mikołaj and I have shelves in our libraries which groan under the weight of Roger's tomes, to which we return to almost on a daily basis, because there is so much. And I think the richness of his inheritance that he's left us is really something that, through Fisher's work and the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, we hope to disseminate further and to bring new light and actually, succor to those who thought as Roger did and just really want those books to give them the basis for their and justification for their thinking. So I think I'm not depressed at all about the future. I think Roger's legacy will spread more and more as the years go by.
You mentioned that Roger was the opposite of an ideologue, and I completely agree. In political terms, the opposite of an ideologue is a dissident. And so I just want to latch on to the last question a little bit and ask from your personal knowledge of Roger, how much did he feel, or how much did he take over from the sense of being a member of the Catholic faith in Central Europe, unequivocally placing you in the dissident category in his own life? He did bring that back with him to England, and towards the end of his life, he became much more religious, even though some might still say that ultimately his relationship with religion was ambiguous. But he did, at least in the last decade, defend religion very strongly against various forms of attack, and again placed himself in the dissident group in that sense. Would you say, or how much of that would you say was an influence of his experience in Central Europe?
Yeah, he, well, as you say, Mikołaj, his attitude towards religion is a complex one. And, I'm sure as you do, I always get asked, well, did Roger believe in God? And I think that, well, we'll never really know, but certainly from reading books like the Face of God and the Soul of the World, those are the two books which actually the Gifford lectures in St Andrews, they were the ones that brought him closest to explaining what he really believed on this. And I think, on the one hand, there are several aspects of his attitude towards religion. One is what he saw in Central Europe, which was the simple faith of ordinary people, believing in something that was greater than themselves, and through that belief engendering a sense of humility and a modesty in their own capabilities. And I think that comforting role of religion he felt to be very, very important. The other aspect of his religion, so certainly in England, obviously, was its cultural aspect of the Church of England, and the way it had almost through osmosis become part and parcel of the almost the English secular identity, and as something that was as part and parcel of village life as was the countryside and the farm animal and the community and the friendships. There was also the village church, to which one went and met one's neighbours, and where Roger himself went and played the organ in the church where he's now buried. So all of these things were aspects of what Roger believed religion to be important for. But I think the way he perceived religion was really to perceive it something that we can only achieve through faith. He never really believed that we could have knowledge of God as such. He had this phrase about the causal envelope, in other words, saying that the reality of God exists beyond the barrier of human perception. Something that he had actually in common with some of the philosophers I was mentioning earlier, whether it was Wittgenstein or Kant. He just believed there's nothing we can say about God because there's no way we can directly experience him. But I think he felt that through aesthetics, through music, through literature, we can get a sense of the boundaries of the ability of human of the boundaries of human perception, and the sense that there is something beyond that. What it is, we just don't know, and it is left to people of faith to actually divine or discern what that is. And that was something that he himself admitted that he was not blessed with. He didn't believe in the afterlife. I think in one of his books he famously calls the afterlife a nonsense. But I think he firmly felt that religious faith is an integral part of human identity. It's a universal urge of the human spirit, is to believe in a transcendent reality that goes beyond us. How we fill that belief is a cultural artifact, and in the West it happens to be the Christian religion. But he, for all sorts of reasons, although I hesitate to say that he was a man who believed in the literal God of Christianity, he was certainly a man of faith who believed that there was something greater than ourselves. And I think in that sense that he's almost more Christian than many Christians who profess to be that today. And he drew on that, and that was a very important part of the way in which he perceived the world, a world that was here and now, but had no value and no sense of beauty unless one was endowed with a consciousness that there was something greater than ourselves illuminating that world, but from an unknown and unknowable source. And that was where he perceived the benefits of Christianity and religion to lie, in the way it, for many people, that it brought sense and beauty and order into a world that might otherwise not be understandable. And I think that's really, if he ever talked about God or religion, I think those are the terms that he would have used to describe his own position on it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. I've got one final question, which I'm burning to ask. It seems that this sense of transcendence, which was so important for Roger as a source of value and meaning in our lives, seems to now be waning in Central Europe to some extent, without the external pressure of the communist system, which enforced the ideology of historical materialism. There seems to be no longer this resistance to that secularization. So Roger evidently thought that the West could look to Central Europe to find this spiritual rejuvenation in the belief in some sort of transcendent justification for our measly lives. But where is Central Europe to look to if that sense of transcendence wanes here? Certainly not to the West. Perhaps a question to finish with, but what would you say, or what would your intuition be about what Roger would say to that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think you're quite right, Mikołaj, and it just shows how quickly things can change. 40 years ago, when Roger started to travel to Poland, the relationship between the ordinary people and religion, Catholic faith, was the Catholic Church, of course, was very, very different to what it is now. Poland today, particularly over the last 10 years or so, has not been immune to the trends of secularism that we see everywhere in the world. Church attendance is particularly among young people. There's a greater resistance to the role of the church in public morality. There are issues with the debate on abortion and so on, which support for liberalization is gaining ground in Poland. And these are all developments which I think Roger would have looked at with real regret. And he would have seen that those processes, which, as you rightly say, well, they're not just confined to Poland, they're everywhere in Central Europe, as part of the increasing challenge that he and other conservative thinkers came across about how to exist in a world which is increasingly not only turning away from God, but through that turning away, opening the door to new beliefs, new ideologies, new quasi-religious almost ideologies and beliefs, which in a bizarre fashion seem to combine what, as I was saying at the beginning, the post-Marxian belief that there is a reality deeper than what appears to be to us in reality, with an almost religious-like fervor in the ceremonies that have to be conducted in order to legitimize those beliefs publicly. And he would have been appalled to see what's been going on in the last couple of years, certainly. And I think he would have been very sad that this seems to be an inevitable progress of history. But he would have sought the reasons for that, and exactly as you say, in the fall of religious belief, he had no real solution other than just really say, ultimately, all that we have to do is rely on our own conscience and say what we believe in. And if what we believe in is truth, beauty, and justice, then that's what we have to speak up about. And that's the only way, the best way, in fact, the only way in which to protect our civilization. And he spoke right to the end. As you know, he wrote until almost his dying breath, and it was a very, very consistent message throughout his life. He was absolutely convinced that he was saying the right thing, and so do many others as well.
Gosh, I think that's an amazing note to wrap up on and leave everyone with that thought. We've moved from your personal relationship with Roger through his relationship to Central Europe to topics that are completely metaphysical, but that was also the way that Roger thought about almost everything. He did not compartmentalize his reflections on politics and economics and philosophy as well as art. He saw them all as part of one enterprise, which is to save the human soul. So it's no wonder that we always end up in this area of big metaphysical questions whenever we touch a topic, even a concrete topic such as Roger's relationship to Central Europe. When we talk about his thought, and this is something that is very characteristic of his writing as well. Thank you very, very much for joining me today for this and for giving this wonderful interview. And I'll just hand over to Fisher.
Thank you, Mikołaj. Thank you.
To say a few final words. Thank you very much, Marek. Over to you, Fisher.
Thank you, Mikołaj. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both, Mikołaj and Marek. Just a wonderful conversation, a very interesting one at that, looking at Scrutin's work in Poland and the larger region of Central Europe, but also a number of things related to it. and I think a great way to start off this new series. And I'm looking forward to what comes next. So thank you.